Welcome everyone to 4RGMeets. My name is Scott McKinley, and my usual co-host Beth is not here with us tonight, and so I am flying solo. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. We appreciate your contribution in showing up, and that represents part of your action against climate change. So 4RGMeets is just one component of For Our Grandchildren, which is a Peterborough Nogojiwanong-based climate action group whose mission is to inspire, inform, and to mobilize people to take effective action in response to the climate crisis. Even if you don't have grandchildren, just remember we are all grandchildren, so everyone is welcome here. We are all volunteers, and if you would like to help out, go to 4rg.ca and join. And then Connie will set you up to do stuff for us. We also have a Facebook group, a Facebook page, Instagram, and apparently Twitter, which I never seem to access, but it's out there, and somebody's managing it, so I don't know who's doing that. Somebody in the group. Tonight we will be examining diversity, and it's important in the climate movement. Dr. Ann Pasek from Trent University is here to explain the evolving research on the demographics of climate opinion and to explore how engagement on the issue varies across communities based on race, gender, class, age, partisan affiliations, geography, and religion. She will help us to understand the value of diversity in climate movement and suggest strategies that can be used to promote more diversity in groups such as ours. But first, we have a land acknowledgement, and Richard, if you are ready to go with that.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Hi, everybody. I'm glad to do the acknowledgement tonight. We respectfully acknowledge that we are located on the Treaty 20 Mississauga territory and the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties Free Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Moseley, and Georgina Island First Nations. For Our Grandchildren respectively acknowledges that the Williams Treaties First Nations are stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters in perpetuity, and that they continue to maintain this responsibility to ensure their health and integrity for generations to come.
Thank you, Richard. So Ann Pasek is an assistant professor and a Canada Research Chair in Media, Culture, and the Environment at Trent University, cross-appointed between the Cultural Studies Department and Trent School of the Environment. Her research explores the cultural politics of climate change with a particular emphasis on the social and technical means through which carbon is enumerated and mobilized within diverse social formations, including climate denialism, the tech sector, and the arts. She is also the director of the Low Carbon Research Methods Group, a network of scholars examining the climate inequity impacts of decarbonizing academic work, and the Experimental Methods and Media Lab, a hub for research creation at Trent, with a particular focus on emerging climate tech. She is energy and climate lead of the Sustainable Subsea Networks project funded by the Internet Society Foundation. So quite a busy lady, and she's here with us tonight to share her wisdom. So anytime you're ready, Ann.
So yeah, thank you all for having me down. This is a real privilege. And as Scott alluded to, I wear many different hats and do many different things. So we can have a conversation that exceeds this talk today, but let me bring you into it. Maybe a more economical way of giving a bio of myself is that I conduct research on how social and cultural factors shape climate politics. And I also, in that auspice, end up teaching communication to environmental studies students at Trent. So I teach students who are scientists how to effectively share their research, and then also how to be more effective activists for the environment in their public communications. And the biggest lesson for scientists, for activists, and for myself, which I often need to take twice, is that there really is no universal message that works ideally to share climate communication. It's always the case you've got to tailor your message to meet the needs, values, and kinds of stories that matter for specific audiences. So sadly, this means that we all need to know our audience. And this is really hard to do, right? It's almost impossible to do this perfectly. We rarely get to know where our message will travel to, nor what the intimate thoughts and feelings of our audience might be, even if we're already in a relationship with them. So there's always an element of guessing involved with public communications, but research can help us make better guesses, and it can provide some sort of shorthand generalizations that we can use on the fly. So let's start with the biggest guess, right? The most important one, right? What do you think is the biggest predictor of climate opinion? So my question for you is, if you could only ask one question about a group that you wanted to speak with about climate change, one question to help you assess whether or not that group that you're talking to is a group that's really concerned about climate change, and really wants to help push for accelerated action, or maybe someone who's on the opposite side of the spectrum who thinks that like climate change is a hoax. What question would you ask? And feel free to unmute if you've got an idea, or pop that idea in the chat. This is the last and only time I will put you on the spot. But if anyone's got an idea in their head, I'd love to hear what it is. What party did you vote for? Yeah, Guy. Education level, that's a good one, Marilyn. How does climate affect you? I like that you're sort of asking for their personal experiences there, Scott. These are good questions. Yeah. So you are all a very smart bunch, but I will say that the first answer was indeed the answer I was looking for. It's partisan affiliation. If you ask someone how they voted, and in particular, if they belong to a political party, if that's part of their identity, you will have, to the best of our demographic knowledge, a shorthand for what they think about climate change. Partisan affiliation is the biggest predictor of climate opinion. This holds true in Canada and the United States. And so you can see that generally, wherever there is a divide between more left-leaning and more right-leaning political parties, those on the left side of that fence tend to be much more worried about climate change than their neighbors. And what's more, this trend has intensified over time. Right? There's this gap between partisan groups, and it's getting worse. And so this tells us that the issue has become polarized, right? So within different political identities, particularly in America with the Republicans, opposing climate action has become a key set of in-group beliefs. So it's a way that many Republicans not only orient their view of the world, but it's also a bit of a yardstick that they can use to see if you're, part of the group or if you're an outsider. So this means that the stakes of changing your opinion inside these communities can be incredibly high, right? It's no longer just the case of saying that you've come to prefer a different set of policy goals. Instead, it's like a whole identity crisis. So this is pretty bad news for the prospects of effective climate action, especially in contexts like the United States, where because of the demographics of the Senate and because of some gerrymandering, right, it's just very unlikely for the Democratic Party to ever decisively hold federal power. So a lot of researchers have begun to ask if the outlook for organizing for climate action within groups that already have strong partisan commitments just isn't looking very good. If things seem pretty set in stone on this front, maybe there are other directions that we could go look for to find groups of people who really care about the climate and all the harms of global warming, but haven't yet been activated, haven't yet been really invited into the movement, offered leadership roles, shown a way to give their time and energy to its goals. And this brings me to demographics. I'd like to guide you through some really recent studies on climate opinion and communication strategies, which all pay attention to trends that occur across different population and social groups, and draw some generalizations that could be helpful for people in the climate movement like yourselves when you tailor your messages to different groups and when you try and build a bigger coalition inside your advocacy efforts. But I want to be clear, though, from the start, that all the stats I'm going to show you are correlative. They're a question of statistical averages, not causes. So it's not the case that everyone in the group necessarily behaves according to that average. And it's also the case that demographic trends aren't destiny. They're really not set in stone. They can shift and change as social and economic circumstances evolve, as well as through like heartfelt, respectful outreach, you know, although probably it's the case that some groups are going to be easier to change than others. So I'll start things off with age. And I know that my audience here today probably skews a little bit older. So I have the pleasure of informing you that you're all statistically unusual. Baby boomers are the least likely generation to consider climate change a threat and to be sympathetic with climate activists. So you all are really quite odd on that front. It's great that you are, but you know, you do not follow the average of your peers. Conversely, on the other end of things, Gen Zers and millennials are really a font of support for more aggressive climate action. They are overwhelmingly in favor. What part of the country you're from also is really relevant. So one thing that you can pick up from these maps, where the yellow color means that you believe that climate change is caused by humans, by fossil fuels, in the yellow there, is that there's a real regional story here, right? So both in Canada and the United States, we see the highest rates of belief about climate change in urban centers, and often around the coast. And moreover, we're more likely to find denialists in regions of the country with close ties to fossil fuels, like Alberta, my home province, right? Really sticks out like a sore thumb on this map. Most Albertans don't think that humans caused climate change. Similarly, in the United States, areas around the Gulf Coast where there's a lot of offshore oil and areas in the interior where there's been a lot of fracking, more people are inclined to doubt. So one key insight we could draw from this data is that a lot of people who are dismissive about climate change maybe have a bit of an economic incentive to be. So if climate change was real, their whole way of life would need to be reevaluated, and that's a pretty big ask. So when you talk with people from certain regions, particularly those who have ties to fossil fuels, you know, you could sort of start that conversation out cautiously, because, you know, there really could be a challenge to having a productive conversation if it proceeds in a linear way. Class is also important, but a little more complicated. And it's one that hasn't been studied as an isolated variable terribly much. From the studies that we do have, it looks like greater levels of climate concern and denial, both at the same time, become more probable as household income increases. So to generalize, if you talk to a low-income family, you might expect that climate change is something that matters less to them, to both positive or negative ends, than a rich family. And this sort of low relevance is probably because when you don't have a lot of money, you tend to have a lot of problems, many of which are quite urgent and short-term, stuff about, you know, the stability of your housing or your savings or your job. And, you know, these are going to be your bigger priorities, bigger than, you know, what will happen 50 years in the future with sea level rise. We also find a bit of a split when it comes to race. Unfortunately, I have no Canadian data here, but I strongly suspect that US patterns are going to hold true to us for a certain degree. Data from the Yale program in climate change communication tells us that white folks are just the least concerned about climate change, and least willing to join a climate action campaign. So again, like looking around this call, we can see this isn't true for everyone. We all might be weirdos here, but it is a really interesting pattern, one that I think begs further explanation. Race and income levels are also big factors in determining what kinds of religious communities you might belong to. And again, I don't have Canadian data, but in American studies, we can see that there are some big differences between different sectarian traditions. So white Catholics and Protestants are the least likely to be engaged on climate, with evangelical Christians being a significant place where climate deniers tend to be located. Conversely, Black and Hispanic churches and non-Christian religions show more climate concern than the national average. So I myself think that this is a kind of expression of how pre-existing demographic patterns show up in faith communities, rather than this being a reflection of anything like internal to the doctrines of different groups or particular religious texts, right? Pretty much all religions include tenets around the protection of vulnerable people and ecological stewardship. So, again, this is just all my opinion, but I think it's really about who and how those texts get interpreted rather than what's in them. So the big picture here in religion is that with a few qualifications, climate concern is generally good. If we look at gender, there's also a divide. So this holds true to different degrees in different countries, but overall, women are much more likely to be concerned about climate change and believe that they will be personally impacted by it and are willing to make changes in their lifestyles to support climate mitigation much more than men. And interestingly, despite all this, women are less likely than men to say that they are well informed about the climate science, even though they test higher on these metrics when we do assess them. So that tells us that there's, this isn't a question of knowing a lot, but it's a question also of, maybe feeling overconfident in what you do know, or being able to different degrees to tie that knowledge to your lived experience and concerns in your community. So if you put some of these pieces of the data together, you find that it's white guys in particular, those that skew conservative and who are financially secure, that are on average the most resistant to climate action. So much so that researchers have started to talk about the white male effect in climate opinion. And opponents of climate action seem to know this too. When we look at studies of disinformation, we know that it is older folks, older men in particular, who are getting served the most misinformation, the most fake information on Facebook, certainly. And it's really a very remarkable distinction in our chart here on the bottom left. It turns out that this white male effect, this pattern also holds true outside of climate change. And we find it in broader questions about environmental protection, public health, and COVID denialism. So there's, something going on here that speaks to the way that gender, race, and age matter in our society and produce different social outcomes and worldviews for people who live different lives. So again, this is a really interesting signal that tells us that there's sort of something here that needs explanation. And we have a couple of different theories for how we would give that explanation. One goes by the name the differential vulnerability hypothesis. So basically, this view holds that part of the reason why we see these demographic divides is because we live in a society that unequally distributes risk. This is a fancy way of saying that our society has some room for improvement when it comes to race, gender, and class, because these factors really do continue to put their thumbs on the scale when it comes to any person's likelihood of having a safe and comfortable life. So because women and people of color have less economic power than men, they are indeed more vulnerable to climate change. So their increased levels of concern correlates to this increased level of risk. And similarly, because of the histories of intergenerational wealth, residential zoning, redlining, and the reservation system in Canada, Black and Indigenous people tend to live in housing stocks and neighborhoods that experience increased levels of climate risk. So this pattern continues there. Their concerns really are a reflection of their lived realities. There are also a host of other hypotheses that suggest that questions of identity are also guided by these demographic shifts. So it's not only that there's different amounts of risk, but there are different stakes in whether or not we adopt a belief or center questions of care or intergenerational or interspecies concern. So some people like women, generally are brought up being more encouraged to put other people's needs in front of themselves. So that may help explain, again, why we see this shift in climate opinion. It might also be the case that people with those economic ties to the fossil fuel industry, or people who are parts of regions in the world where those industries are just really ubiquitous, really well established, they're more inclined to oppose climate action because they see it as a threat to both their economic prosperity and really moral sense of self. So you hear this a lot when you listen to between the lines of what a climate skeptic says. They're often really disturbed by the idea that the things they've been taught to value, things like having a single family home, a dependable car, or a skilled job in the trades, right? Like all these things are now being cast as really villainous. And so, by extension, maybe they're a villain, right? Like that's not a good feeling. And so it's understandable that people work hard not to feel it. So recognizing this helps us find our way through the puzzle of educational attainment. Turns out the more education you have, the more concerned you are about climate change, unless you're a white conservative. In this case, we predict that your concern will actually go down after you get a university degree. So this is always a little worrying to college professors like myself, right? We tend to assume that more education is always a good thing. And in the climate movement, there's many of us who really focus just on raising awareness as our #1 goal. But this data tells us that when people's identities are threatened, they often draw on all those reasoning skills they picked up in college to think of ways that like inconvenient idea might be wrong or just might not apply to them. So more awareness isn't universally a good. So how do these differences show up in the climate movement? I think it's a fair generalization to make that most environmental groups started out and still are disproportionately white, educated, left of center, and upper class. And this has changed to a degree in recent years, but the trend still holds. As an example, this is data from an American chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby. And you can see that their racial composition is just way, way off the national average, although it is slowly trending more towards being representative. And though I only have anecdotal data here, I've noticed that people in this group in particular, like a lot of environmental groups, there's like sometimes a few more women than men, and just generally way more folks with higher education and higher earning potential, although this is slowly becoming a little bit less of an extreme trend in the group. But people do pick up on this to the extent that biases and stereotypes can form that make non-white people less inclined to see environmentalism as a legible part of their personal and group identities, even though we know that they care about this issue, often more than the average white person does. But just as an example here, when I type environmentalist into Google image search, the first results I am shown are almost exclusively all white folks, people who look pretty comfortable, right? And if that's all you're seeing under the auspices of climate change or environmentalism, and you don't look like that, pretty understandable if you don't really think that you've got a role to play here, that maybe you aren't going to be included, that maybe your concerns aren't their concerns. And, for a lot of its history, environmental groups working on climate change did focus more on non-human threats than on human ones. So there was a lot of talk about polar bears, so much so that they were taken to be like the charismatic spokesperson or spokes animal, if you will, for the climate movement. But this really can and did backfire when the risks that you're talking about with the most emphasis are not the risks that your audience maybe is the most worried about. So it's hard, to go all out for the polar bears when you're worried about making bill payments, when you can't drink the water in your reservation, or when you might be the victim of a hate crime, right? You might imagine how someone who went through, a home foreclosure or a catastrophic flood might feel not very favorably inclined towards the guy in the polar bear suit holding up this sign, right? They might even seem a little bit out of touch, and maybe even someone who wants something that comes at the expense of you getting what you need. So again, like these communication trends and these demographic trends really can double over each other and reinforce that trend. And to go back to where I started from tonight, the other consequence is that if the climate movement stays pretty white, pretty upper class, we are leaving potential allies behind. Those who could be a really, really key factor in breaking the partisan divides on this issue, right? We know that people care. They just haven't been invited in yet. So I want to really put my cards on the table here and suggest that diversity in the climate movement is really two things at the same time. So at first, it's a moral question. And I think that's where a lot of us start and stop the conversation. particularly if we have like existing anti-racist commitments, right? We can say that it's morally important to have an inclusive social movement that pulls against, again, these aspects of society where there are some room for improvement. I haven't focused on this in my remarks today because I'm making the assumption that you probably run into these kinds of arguments fairly often. They're universal arguments, right? Like it's fair to say that like racism is never okay. And the climate movement should be no different in trying to center anti-racism in its activities. The second question that's at play, though, is a really, really urgent strategic question, right? So in order to meet our climate targets, in order to win massive scales of change, we need to work across all areas of social and economic life to get there. And we really need everyone out on the street, right? Pushing hard. And it's strategic to spend time and effort working to invite in and mobilize folks who say they already care on the issue and who are already slated to be disproportionately impacted by it. And unlike the moral question, this isn't a universal question. It's one that is sort of locally specific because the diversity of who's around you will be different wherever you go in the world. But it's often always the case, right? That there's somebody who hasn't yet been invited to the table, someone who would be a great person to have there if there was some forethought. So I'll end by putting out just a couple of ideas for directions we could pursue with both this moral and strategic goal in mind. The first would be to think about issues that are already climate issues, but aren't going by that by name. Stuff like energy prices, access to good transit, air pollution, other public determinants of health. So marginalized communities are already concerned about these issues because they're living them, and sort of saying that you care about them too, that you want that to be sort of part of the banner of what climate action means and cares about and fights for can be really immensely helpful. Then it sort of becomes a question of how you can build relationships with advocates on these issues, relationships that aren't instrumental, that aren't just a kind of one-sided active opportunity, but which help form genuine coalitions that energize your mutual activism. So it's a question of how you share resources, who shows up at your rally, who shows up at their rally, who knocks on doors for an issue, and just so much more. It means that, as your definition of climate is being sort of pulled into many different interesting specific directions, you're following that and making the link back to the policy goals that you want to win, because it really is a case of changing everything. And so there's always room to sort of bring people in. But at the same time, I do want to note that like promoting diversity doesn't mean that everything needs to look outrageously and perfectly demographically representative all of the time. In fact, as I tell people when I'm teaching communications, a message that appeals to everyone isn't likely to appeal to anyone particularly strongly. And people generally receive messages best when the spokesperson of that idea is someone who shares the same life experiences with them. And this means that there's no one person, right, who's going to be equally effective at reaching all audiences, right? At some points that will be you, at other times it won't. And so this means, again, because this is a strategic question, because this is a local question, I think it means that the climate movement overall needs more spokespeople and leaders from all walks of life, and that those that it has should be encouraged to work in their areas of strength. So for example, 4RGMeets is a specialized group, right? You are often organizing older generations to work on climate action. And we really need you to do this, right? The data tells us, right, that your peers aren't as engaged as they could be. And you have a unique opportunity to speak about how your lived experiences and concerns connect to climate action, and to do so in ways that are authentic and that can really reach your peers in ways that no one else can. And so, I don't think that it would make sense, or at least might not be the most rewarding return on your efforts, right, if you were to focus exclusively on like a multi-generational kind of climate action. But you probably do want to link up with youth climate strikes when they're happening. And if you're, you find yourself suddenly the only climate group in town and no one's organizing the younger and middle-aged folks, you might want to reconsider your scope and how you can maybe help support the formation of other organizations led by people from those groups in question. So again, this is a strategic question that might be different across other demographic questions like race or income. I don't know enough to speculate further about this myself in relation to your group. But hopefully I've set you up with some interesting data to guide your internal discussions. I will leave it there, and hopefully we got some time to have a good conversation about this all. Cheers.
Well, thanks very much for that, Anne. That was eye-opening, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions. First, we have a word from Marilyn Freeman, who's going to speak to.
Hi there. Yeah, eye-opening is really, really something. I've been very busy writing notes, and I've highlighted two things that really jumped out at me. One was boomers are creeps. Like, oh, I've just lost, I am a boomer, okay? And I'm just losing faith in my cohort. What happened to us? And the other one was that the white male effect actually has a name, of the white male effect. I hadn't come across that before. So that's a very handy moniker through which to approach things with other people with whom I speak. I really liked what you had to say about just like the last thing. 4RG is mostly a bunch of older people, not entirely, but mostly. And this is our strength and should be played upon as our strength. But of course, remembering to link up with other groups, as we have done and are beginning to do even more. So this was really cool. Thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you, Marilyn. I hope that you find a fun opportunity to gracefully fit in the white male effects at a dinner party or something.
You bet.
maybe not when you are directly experiencing it. That might backfire.
Okay, so at this point, then we would like to open the floor to questions from everyone, and or comments or experiences or whatever you have that you would like to share.
Hi, Anne. I have two questions. One is, I'm curious about gender and transgendered and sexual orientation. Where are the gay and lesbian people who have tons of resources? Where are they?
But to go to your question about gay, lesbian, and trans communities, I think it's interesting because as far as I know, no one has done a really comprehensive study yet. So we're sort of dealing mostly with anecdote here and reports from within the community. And I have read some really interesting pieces by people making the case that, when we think about improving quality of life for queer people and trans people, we got to think about climate change, because just like every other marginalized group, we know that people who are trans in particular, to a lesser extent, gay and lesbian people, they tend to, experience discrimination in the world. And that, comes at the cost of having equal and excellent access to quality housing, to high paying employment. That isn't true for everyone in the community, right? I think you alluded to the fact that there are some, folks who've made it quite well. And like, why aren't they going all in for climate action is again, an interesting question. I noticed, I've got a friend who's a scholar of social movements, who studies in particular gay and lesbian organizing in New York. And the story that she tells is that when gay marriage was won, a lot of the big donors for that campaign just like packed up and they're like, we're done donating. We got what we wanted. So, it's always the case, right? That like, when you win something, you demobilize a little bit.
Okay.
But I think it's the case that like, people in those communities need to do a bit of barn raising, right? because it really is the case that there's, again, a moral and strategic case to be made about not leaving people behind and not giving up the fight when, you know, your risk perception is now lower.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Cheers.
that. Jeff and Wendy.
I guess something I wanted to comment on the first slide, which was showing by political affiliation how people felt about climate change. And I guess my comment is with respect to electoral reform within Canada, and I guess to some extent within the US as well, because their political system could use a lot of reform as well. So people need to be aware of our horrible first past the post system that skews our results, and the fact that we could end up with a conservative majority government with only getting 35% of the popular vote. So I just wanted to sort of comment on that, and I'm not sure if you had anything you wanted to add on to that, Anne.
Yeah, I agree with you that that's a really salient way to look at the data. And you know, I'm certainly only like offering a personal opinion here. But I do think that moving away from a first past the post system would be really helpful. There's some useful suggestions around a winner takes all system can kind of reward polarization, because it doesn't matter if you have like the majority of the votes, if you just have enough to kind of get a little bit more than anyone else, because you've got a passionate base that believes conspiracy theories or you know, believes they're under attack and so is kind of, you know, mobilized defensively and is full of fear, right? That's not going to be a winning solution for the climate. So I think in like European countries where there is more of a, you know, parliamentary or distributed system, we're seeing more climate action, and it's a correlation, but it's an interesting one to me. So I'm with you on that front. Scott, I see your hand.
Yes, I have a question. Well, a comment and question. So I'll share experience from a rally that we were involved with. When was that? I think it was last fall. And we were downtown, and we were near where there was a session going on where people were getting some food. There was for poor people and such. So we're kind of in the middle of that, and people were going up and down the sidewalk, and one lady stopped and said to me, "I don't care about the damn climate change when I don't have anywhere to live." and a valid point. And so I did chat with her and a person that she was with for a little while, and just, you know, seeing what their concerns were. And I mean, it was nice that we did chat and everything, but I was left at the end of it, like, in a group like ours, like in 4RG, how do we even, like, I suppose other than going to their rallies and making our faces seen there so that they know we're on their side, how do we involve that segment of society more?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great example, right? Because from her perspective, and I think from the perspective of a lot of folks in the climate movement, right, it seems like we're sort of looking at two circles more than a Venn diagram. So you kind of have to think about, like, you know, where is that mutual intersection of concerns? And like there usually always is one. On the case of housing, like I love thinking about housing reform, because again, like our housing emissions are a large part of our global climate budget, and particularly in Canada, where it gets real cold, we need to do a lot to decarbonize our housing stock. And the market itself is not doing a great job. Instead, you know, as you hear in all the rallies around Bill 23, right? It's just building more mansions in the suburbs, and that's not helping the folks out on the street, and it's not helping our climate numbers. So when I think about like the solutions I'd want to see and the solutions that might help build a coalition, it would look something like a push for public housing. That, you know, you can access not based on need, right, rather than your income level, and which has a high quality environmental standing. So, you know, there's some folks in the corners of like policy proposals like the Green New Deal that are trying to, you know, make this a sort of key and exciting part of climate action. So, you know, you could think about in the larger political advocacy of the group, maybe there's a case to get together with housing advocates and make a push for green public housing. Something like that might be handy. But it really is a case of sort of like being strategic, reading the water, seeing where local concerns are, and then where public attention is going, and then seeing if you can kind of play a supporting role, saying like, this is also a climate issue, and goodness, we all need to work to have cleaner housing for all.
And I suppose we don't necessarily have to even frame it as a climate issue, as long as we kind of understand that it does help, but it's also helping a particular group. I mean, I'm thinking of tiny homes in Peterborough, and actually there's a few people from this group that are involved in that group as well, and maybe putting a more official coalition together with that would be something that might help, I suppose.
Yeah. It's good to, again, like kind of think in campaigns, and then think about the coalition that will form around that campaign, and then pick, of the many infinite possibilities that might obtain here, right? Like pick the one where you think there's momentum, where you think you've got a good chance of winning, and where, you can build some lasting relationships. Yeah, and if your membership is already doing the tiny house thing, that's a great sign.
Not that we're actually actively participating in it, but I would think that if you look around the room here, you'd find that there's many people who are also closely involved with all that stuff, but not with our 4RG hat on when we do it. It's just as individuals. And I was going to say that when someone asked you about where are the gay and lesbian communities, why don't you ask who they voted for? And maybe that lines them up in the right place. But I also wanted to say that, ask for your comments on what we've been trying to do in For Our Grandchildren to broaden the representation of other people inside our organization, which is we've reached out and invited younger people to be on the board of directors. And our reasoning for that is, first of all, we're getting old and we're going to die. But besides that, I felt we were missing out on how to make the message appropriate for younger people, for example. Do you think that makes sense? Do you think that's a better idea than just playing to our strength?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting kind of crossroad moment. I'll say for myself, I'm relatively new to Peterborough, as you know. I've been here for only a couple of years, and so I'm still trying to find where my people are, figure out where the most exciting climate activism that I want to plug into could be. And For Our Grandchildren honestly wasn't a very intuitive fit in just my initial gloss, because I'm I'm not a grandmother, and I'm probably never gonna be. I'm not planning on having kids, so it just sort of seemed like that tie wasn't one that I could really participate in. So I don't know, maybe that's more of a queer community thing than a demographic thing, like an age thing on one level. So if you decide the way forward is to, again, do something intergenerational, then, you might contemplate a name change or some sort of, strategic rebranding.
Don't get us started with that. We've been around and around and around the bush. We would be somebody trying to be something for everybody.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Really, right now, if we show up at City Hall and we say we're For Our Grandchildren, they say, oh, we know who you are. If we showed up and we said, well, we're the old For Our Grandchildren, we're somebody else now, we would lose 10 years of building a reputation. Sorry, Anne, but we've internally quarreled, that's not quite the right word, but discussed that a lot.
And not only that, but at the Friday night meeting, we discussed it a lot, and we have a new brochure saying that we have young people from different different groups and ideas for things. For instance, with Teresa doing the arts one, I met a lot of different young people and even had discussions about what they thought about Peterborough, and some of them were very, wanted to sign up right away. So it's going to be interesting to see how much we can get them involved. So every time I meet somebody, I tell them how much our group has changed in the last 2 years. And that more people are joining automatically, because it's not, just for old people.
Yeah.
And line, we are all grandchildren.
Mhm. Yeah.
And you
Yeah,
don't have,
yeah,
you
Scott's
don't have
good
to
at
be
that.
a grandfather
Yeah.
or a grandson. You are
Yeah.
a grandchild.
Yeah.
And I think you've given us a lot to think about. I really thank you for that. It really,
Mhm.
really insightful, and building coalitions may be a real push like that. That's very interesting with other like-minded groups and supporting them. And I think if we need to, or if the idea is to build to our strengths, we need to know what those strengths are. And
Yeah.
I just wonder about electoral strengths. You know, does this demographic vote? And more so.
That they do. That they
And
do.
is that a strength, you know, for us
Yes.
to play up to politicians? I know there's a political group with 4RG, and I've not been involved. I've just done the event stuff, but it does make me think of that.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, but the coalition thing, good work. Yes.
And like for what it's worth, I'll say that
In the,
every advocacy group I've ever been a part of has always had this sort of like internal tension about like, you know, what do we do best? Who are we serving? Are we evolving uncomfortably away from that? Or are we moving into a new area of expertise? It seems like, you know, we never get to escape those questions and debates. And it's just a kind of like a matter of having clear eyes, right? About where the future might be going. And sometimes that's a gamble. So I have no good advice on that front, just sympathy that like, yeah, I've been there. I will say that among the groups I've found so far, y'all are maybe the most organized. So I tip my hats because that's never
Whoa.
an easy thing to pull
Oh,
off.
man, sure doesn't feel like that from the inside.
No.
well, if there are no other comments or questions, then I guess it is time to call it an evening. And once again, we'd like to thank you very much, Anne, for coming out. And
Thanks, Anne.
and it really has been eye-opening, and there's going to be a lot of discussion. So thanks again for that, and thank you everyone else that came out to take part in this and join the conversation.
Thanks,
Yeah, cheers
Scott.
all.
Thank
for
you very
these
much,
games.
Anne.
Thanks, Anne.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.